Hey guys, and welcome to today's idiot video. Today we are going to be discussing a video I came across posted by Eric Dubay. In this video, titled How Gravity Works on a Flat Earth, Eric Dubay puts his stupidity on display, getting almost every aspect about what gravity is and how it works completely wrong. But Eric Dubay is a dumbass flat earth idiot. So let's begin.
Long before the theory of gravity was a glimmer in Newton's imagination, the natural physics of density and buoyancy already perfectly explained why apples fall down.
Actually, density is a descriptor, which means it is simply telling you information about the physical properties of an object and represents a given amount of mass in a given amount of volume. But what is it going to take to get you flat earth idiots to understand that buoyancy means nothing without the presence of an accelerating force? In fact, the equation for the buoyant force is equal to rho vg, where rho represents the density of the surrounding fluid, v equals the displaced volume of fluid, and g equals
gravity, you fucking retard! Gravity! Have you ever heard of fucking gravity? Gravity!
So without g, buoyancy means nothing and doesn't tell us anything about which way different densities will align themselves.
Quite simply, objects fall or rise based on their relative density to the medium surrounding them.
Well, it's not as simple as you think, you simpleton, because the moment you remove the gravitational acceleration from the buoyant force equation, you lose the directional vector that describes in which direction objects will organize themselves based on relative density. I am still confused as to why flat earthers use buoyancy to describe gravity when buoyancy is dependent on an accelerating force like gravity to even make sense. Flat earthers are literally walking contradictions, and don't forget, they're idiots too.
Apples fall because they are denser than the air, while helium balloons rise because they are lighter. No gravity necessary.
Eric Dubay, you're an idiot. Why exactly do apples always fall and never rise? Just saying they are denser is describing the physical properties of the object, not explaining why they move in the direction they do. And everything is falling, including the helium balloons. The air around it is just falling with a greater force than the helium balloons, and the apples are falling with a greater force than the air that surrounds it. If gravity doesn't exist, then flat earthers are going to have to make up some other illogical, unprovable nonsense to explain why objects fall and don't just stay in place when they're released.
This is why raindrops fall down through the air, and air bubbles rise up through water. Everything seeks its relative density and rises or falls until settling accordingly.
The raindrops fall down through the air because the force of gravity pulling down on the raindrops is greater than the force of gravity pulling down on the same volume of air, because the raindrops are more dense than the air. The same thing goes for the bubbles rising up through the water. The force of gravity is pulling down on both the water and the air, however it's pulling down on the water with more force than the air. When this occurs, the water above or in the opposite direction of the accelerating force will displace the air below it even though they are both being pulled in the same direction. This will continue until the medium above the air is less dense or being pulled down with less force. Air bubbles confuse the shit out of flat earthers, and I think it's hilarious because flat earthers are idiots.
This is why a tiny pebble sinks to the bottom of the ocean, but gigantic cruise ships and aircraft carriers stay afloat on the surface. Because even though a pebble is so small, its mass relative to its volume, its density, is more than water, so it sinks.
Sometimes I wonder if Eric Dubay stole his entire flat earth argument from an elementary school science fair. Yes, we know that a pebble of greater relative density than an aircraft carrier in its entirety will sink to the bottom of the ocean while the more massive ship floats. What you don't get is that this is direct evidence of the presence of gravity, you idiot. Let's say we have a steel cube that's hollow on the inside and we drop it in water and it floats. Why does it float? If steel is more dense than the water surrounding it, then shouldn't it sink to the bottom? The air should be resting on the inside of the steel box at the bottom, completely closed off from the outside of the steel box. So if gravity doesn't exist, then the presence of the air would actually play no role in whether the box floats or sinks. You must add an accelerating force that acts on everything, including the air on the inside of the box, for this observation to make any sense whatsoever. Once you add the force of gravity, the different densities will align themselves by the force exerted on them and in the direction of the point at which the force is being exerted.
If Newton's apple had landed in a puddle instead of on his head, he would have seen the apple only fell through the air because it was denser than the air, but then floated on top of the water because it was less dense than water.
The story of an apple falling on Isaac Newton's head is allegorical at best. The real story is that he noticed two observations while pondering in his family's apple orchard that eventually led to his laws of gravitational attraction. 1. That when an apple falls, it accelerates. And 2. That it always falls down and never in any other direction. Whether the apple fell to the ground or in a puddle of water would have made no difference in Isaac Newton determining that the force attracting the objects was directly proportional to the mass of the objects and inversely proportional to the square of the distance separating the objects.
Submarines float on the surface when their ballast tanks are filled with air, but when the vents are opened and seawater floods in, they begin to sink as the submarine's density becomes greater than water.
Exactly, and this is another great example of the presence of gravity, you idiot. As I've already said, without an accelerating force pulling down on everything, including the air on the inside of the submarine, the more dense hull of the submarine should sink straight to the bottom of the ocean, regardless of the configuration of the ballast. The only time filling the ballast with air would cause you to float is when you make the mass of the entire submarine system, hull, ballast, and all, less than that of the mass of seawater of an equal volume. At this point, the force pulling down on the same volume of water is greater than the force pulling down on the submarine. There is no other way of explaining this phenomenon without gravity.
Depending what depth they wish to dive, sailors simply adjust the ratio of air and water in their tanks, and when ready to resurface, they blow compressed air into the tanks, forcing the seawater out, lowering the density, and thus causing them to rise back to the surface.
And how exactly do you think they can calculate how much air needs to be removed or added to attain a certain depth? It can't possibly be from lucky guessing alone, can it? No, you idiot. We use the buoyant force equation along with our knowledge of the submarine's total density to know exactly how much air should be added or removed to the ballast to attain a certain depth, which happens to be when the force pulling down on the entire volume of the submarine is equal to the force pulling down on the displaced volume of water. Think of it like this. To sink your sub, you must force the air in the ballast into compressed air tanks and fill that volume with seawater. The additional seawater is heavier than the air it displaced, causing the submarine system to have a greater density. The total amount of force pulling down on the submarine then becomes greater than the force pulling down on the same volume of water at sea level, and the submarine begins to sink. As it sinks, the weight of the water it displaces increases until the weight of the water the submarine displaces equals the weight of the submarine. This is the point where the buoyant force pushing up on the submarine is equal to the force pulling down on the submarine by gravity, and the sub will no longer sink. Again, there is no other way to explain this phenomenon without gravity.
We can also prove this fact of relative density by filling a balloon with approximately half helium and half air. Since helium is lighter than the oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases that compose the air around us, filling a balloon with just the right amount of helium to compensate for and balance out the density of the plastic results in a gravity-defying, levitating balloon at equilibrium that neither rises nor falls.
The balloon floats due to the same explanation as to why a sub sinks and floats. If you fill the balloon with the atmosphere around it alone, then the total weight of the balloon material and the air inside will weigh more than the same volume of just air, and the balloon will sink. By replacing the air with helium, the total weight of the helium balloon will weigh less than the same volume of just air, and it will rise. But by adding a lighter gas like helium with the air inside the balloon, the weight of the balloon system will eventually equal the same weight as the displaced volume of air, and it will be suspended.
How is it that gravity is so strong that it can hold all the oceans, buildings, and people stuck to the underside of the ball Earth, but so weak that it allows birds, bugs, smoke, and balloons to casually evade its grips completely?
Because of something called aerodynamics, you idiot. For this example, we are not going to consider thrust and drag, just lift and gravity. We've already discussed gravity as a force pulling down on objects, and the strength of the force is directly related to its mass. So a tiny butterfly with a tiny amount of mass will also have a tiny amount of gravity pulling down on it. By flapping its wings, a butterfly begins generating lift, and once the amount of lift force has exceeded the amount of gravitational force, the butterfly will begin to fly.
How is it that gravity holds our bodies clung to the underside of a ball Earth?
Well, first off, there's no such thing as the underside of a ball Earth. Every point on the spherical Earth can be considered the top from the perspective of that point. Under denotes beneath. Beneath denotes up and down. Down is defined by the direction of the pull of gravity. So the underside of a ball Earth is technically the center of gravitational attraction, which then answers your dumbass question, you flat Earth idiot.
But yet we can easily raise our legs and arms, walk or jump, and feel no such constant downward pulling force.
This is a conceptual problem for flat Earth idiots, as they don't understand that when you jump, you immediately begin accelerating back to the Earth at 9.8 meters per second squared, even while you're moving up in the air. Let's say that you jump straight up with an initial velocity of 9.8 meters per second. Exactly 1 second later, you will have reached your apex in a velocity of exactly 0.0 meters per second, before beginning to accelerate towards the ground, where you will land exactly 1 second later at a velocity of 9.8 meters per second. Without gravity, there would be no decelerating force to slow down your velocity and return you to the ground. So you would essentially just continue in the direction you jumped at 9.8 meters per second forever.
How is it that gravity can cause planets to revolve elliptical orbits around a single center of attraction? Ellipses by nature require two foci, and the force of gravitation would have to regularly increase and decrease to keep planets in constant orbit and prevent pulling them into direct collision courses.
No. Without the force of gravity being constant, the orbit wouldn't make an ellipse, and there would be no regularity in the orbital periods. And going all the way back to Kepler's laws, gravitational ellipses already took into account two focal points or foci. You obviously don't have a clue what you're talking about. Can you offer some kind of explanation as to why anything you say is even possible? Or is everything you said nothing more than a big bowl of non-scientific and non-mathematic word salad, meant to keep the unintelligent Neanderthal flat earthers from starving? Eric Dubay, you're an idiot.
Einstein's theory of relativity and the entire heliocentric model of the universe hinge upon Newton's law of gravitation.
Right, because massive objects attracting towards each other is observationally consistent throughout the universe. Gravitational attraction is a consequence of mass warping and displacing the fabric of space-time, but the force of attraction is by no means the most important foundation of the heliocentric model. We gave up on gravitational attraction through an invisible force when Einstein supplanted Newton's laws of gravitation with his own theories of relativity. Einstein's theories of relativity are dependent upon the speed of light remaining constant in all frames of reference, so the heliocentric model relies more on the constant speed of light than Newton's laws of gravitational attraction.
They claim that gravity also somehow allows people, buildings, the oceans, and all of nature to exist on the underside of their ball Earth without falling off.
Eric Dubay, you're an idiot. Gravity is a radial force, meaning it starts at one point and extends radially in all directions. So down, underside, below, beneath, and whatever else you flat earthers want to say is all relative to a single point in the middle of the earth. In other words, down to people in Australia points to the same point that down to everyone else on the other side of the globe points to. This dumbass flat earth argument only goes to show how intellectually limited flat earthers are in their ability to comprehend complex structures.
Now, even if gravity did exist, why would it cause both planets to orbit the sun and people to stick to the Earth?
Finally, a flat earther that asks an actual question that doesn't strawman our position. The force of gravity causes a downward acceleration towards the center of mass. For an object to remain in orbit, it must have a tangential velocity that, when factoring in the drop due to the acceleration of gravity, results in the distance from the center of mass to be relatively the same from point to point on the orbit. I say relatively because orbits aren't necessarily circular, but elliptical. If you were to increase the tangential speed, you will increase the size of the orbit, and decreasing the speed will decrease the size of the orbit. During the Apollo 13 mission, NASA engineers had to apply the concepts of Newtonian gravity to use the moon's gravitational acceleration to slingshot the astronauts back to Earth. Without a complete understanding of Newtonian gravity, we would not have been able to correctly predict the trajectory to bring our astronauts back home.
Gravity should either cause people to float in suspended circular orbits around the Earth, or it should cause the Earth to be pulled and crashed into the sun.
Or gravity could be constant and the circular velocities could be different. Circular velocity is the relative velocity an object must reach in order for it to go into orbit. This velocity is calculated by this formula. V equals the square root of big G times m1 plus m2 divided by r, where m1 is the mass of the object being orbited, m2 is the mass of the object orbiting it, and r is the radius of the orbit from the center of mass, where mass is measured in kilograms and radius is in meters. From this point moving forward, when calculating velocities, we are going to assume that there is no atmospheric drag. Now let's calculate how fast we would have to fire a bullet at 1 meter off the surface of the Earth so that the bullet never returns to the surface. We can discard m2 as the mass of the bullet is so small that even when added to the mass of the Earth, you get essentially the same value as just the mass of the Earth. Now let's pull out our circular velocity equation and do some math. We get v equals the square root of 6.6738 times 10 to the negative 11th times 5.9722 times 10 to the 24th divided by 6,371,001 meters to get approximately 7,909 meters per second or 7.9 kilometers per second. So if we were to fire a bullet at 7.9 kilometers per second at 1 meter above the Earth, it would follow the curve of the Earth and achieve orbit.
The two effects are very different, yet the same cause is attributed to both.
Gravity is responsible for both observations, as both objects are under constant acceleration towards the center of mass. However, the object that's in orbit has achieved a circular velocity that keeps it from ever hitting the ground. An object stuck to the surface at the equator will have a circular velocity of only about 447 meters per second, which is about 5% of the 7,909 meters per second needed to attain orbit. Eric Dubay, learn some math. Then come tell us why it's not possible, because right now, you look like an idiot.
Furthermore, this magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world.
Probably because gravity is not magnetism, you idiot. I really hate when flat earthers try to compare gravity to magnetism. Gravity is by no means even similar to magnetism, except for the fact that its intensity falls off at the inverse of the distance squared from the source of attraction. Gravity does not show a preference to the material it's attracting like magnetism does. In other words, it attracts non-magnetic materials with the same strength as magnetic materials of the same mass.
There is no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object which, by virtue of its mass alone, causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it.
Dubay, the Earth, you idiot. So let's talk about why this argument is fallacious and why flat earthers continue to demand it. First off, with our understanding of reality, the force of gravity is predominantly provided by the mass of the Earth. So for anyone to show this experiment, you would need something that has a greater gravitational pull than the Earth. So let's do some math. Let's say that we want to demonstrate water sticking to a ball by virtue of its mass alone. That means that at the surface of the sphere, the gravitational acceleration would have to be greater than the gravitational acceleration of the Earth, which is 9.8 meters per second squared at its surface. So let's just say that our sphere needs to have a gravitational acceleration at its surface of 10 meters per second squared. This acceleration is determined by the mass of the sphere and the distance the surface is from the center of mass. Now let's set a size for this sphere, because it can't be too big as it makes this thought experiment impractical. So let's say that the radius of the sphere is 10 meters. Now that we have the acceleration we need and the distance from the center of mass, we can find out what total mass the sphere would need to be to overtake the gravitational pull of the Earth and have water sticking to the outside. We apply the equation A equals big G times mass of the sphere divided by r squared. We can then rewrite the equation to solve for the mass of the sphere. M equals A times r squared divided by big G, where A equals 10 meters per second squared, r equals 10 meters, and big G equals 6.6738 times 10 to the negative 11th. When solving for this equation, we get a spherical mass of approximately 1.5 times 10 to the 13th kilograms, or 16.5 billion tons, all packed into a sphere only 20 meters wide. Now that we know this answer, we can finally understand why flat earthers demand this observation for proof of gravity, because it's humanly impossible to fit 16 billion tons of material into a sphere only 20 meters wide. Therefore, we cannot overtake the gravitational pull of the Earth, even if we tried.
Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off and nothing sticks to or orbits around it.
Of course water is going to fly off the tennis ball, you idiot, because angular momentum is a thing. If you spun the tennis ball at the same angular rate as the Earth, like once per day, I guarantee you that water won't go flying off like that. And we already covered why objects don't orbit or stick to the tennis ball, but because math is fun, let's calculate how much mass the tennis ball must have to overtake the accelerating force of gravity from the Earth. We will use 10 meters per second squared again for the gravitational acceleration of this tennis ball. The official diameter of a tennis ball must be between 6.54 and 6.86 centimeters. So let's choose something in the middle, like 6.66 centimeters or 3.33 centimeters as the radius. We will use the same equation as before. Mass of the tennis ball equals A times r squared divided by big G. Solving for this equation, the tennis ball must have a mass of only about 166 million kilograms to have a gravitational acceleration greater than that of the Earth's.
Newton also theorized, and it is now commonly taught, that the Earth's ocean tides are caused by gravitational lunar attraction. If the Moon is only 2,160 miles in diameter, and the Earth 8,000 miles, however, using their own math and law, it follows that the Earth is 87 times more massive, and therefore the larger body should attract the smaller to it, and not the other way around. If the Earth's greater gravity is what keeps the Moon in orbit, it is impossible for the Moon's lesser gravity to supersede the Earth's gravity at Earth's sea level, where its gravitational attraction would even further out-trump the Moon's.
Do you really think that a flat earth idiot like Eric Dubay is qualified to explain how force vectors like gravity works? The force pulling on any object in a given direction is actually a combination of all forces acting upon that object. So the sublunar point, or the point directly between the Earth and the Moon, will experience the highest amount of gravitational pull from the Moon. So the water molecules around this area experience the force of gravity pulling down towards the Earth and the Moon pulling up, resulting in a reduced force vector pointing towards the middle of the Earth. I wanted to leave this part at this point, but I realized that there was some more math to do, so let's do it. Let's calculate the difference in gravitational attraction at the sublunar point. The Moon has a mass of 7.3477 times 10 to the 22nd kilograms, and an approximate distance of 385,000 kilometers from the center of Earth. Let's not forget to take out the distance from the surface to the center of the Earth of 6,371 kilometers, so from the Earth's surface to the Moon's point of attraction is 378,629 kilometers. Using the same equation as before, big G times mass of the Moon divided by r squared, we can solve for the gravitational acceleration towards the Moon at the sublunar point on the surface of Earth, which is 0.00003421 meters per second squared, or just enough to have the waters around the world swell just a bit from the Moon's gravity, but not enough to lift the waters from the surface of the Earth. Just for shits and giggles, I calculated how much mass the moon would have to slowly siphon the water off of the Earth's surface, and that number came out to 2.1481 times 10 to the 28th kilograms, or about 3,600 times more massive than the Earth, with only 2% of its volume. That's a relative density of about 180,000 times more dense than the Earth, but only 1% as dense as Eric Dubay's skull, because Eric Dubay is a flat earther, and all flat earthers are idiots.
Heliocentrists claim the ball Earth is perpetually spinning on its axis at a mind-numbing 1,038 miles per hour, or 19 miles per second.
Want to do your math again, idiot? Anything traveling at 1,038 miles per hour does not travel at 19 miles per second, as 19 miles per second comes out to 68,400 miles per hour. 1,038 miles per hour is actually only approximately 0.3 miles per second. Alright guys, I think this is where we're going to stop today. It's obvious that Eric Dubay is not smart enough to understand why he is so completely wrong. As a matter of fact, I actually like when a flat earther brings up Eric Dubay's 200 proofs the earth is not spinning in an argument, because I know it's going to be an easy win for Team Skeptic, because flat earthers, especially Eric Dubay, are idiots. Now I'd like to take the time out to thank Eric Dubay for stepping away from his normal profession as a Thai backpage model to remind us of how he is personally responsible for so many flat earth idiots across the globe, because Eric Dubay, you are a fucking idiot. So you stuck around. Why? Because maybe the math put you into a comatose state? Don't worry, 15 minutes from now, you will be close to normal again. I hope. Thanks again for all the supporters of my channel, whether through channel memberships, Patreon, or my official Team Skeptic merchandise store. I truly appreciate it. I'm Father Skeptic, and I'm out.